Hello everyone. The work that I'm presenting today is currently in preparation, so I really appreciate your ideas and feedback after the presentation. And I'd just like to highlight Toby Sang, who is not here today. He's a postdoc at the University of Hong Kong, who is a co-first author with me on this work. He did a lot of the analyses. So I guess we're all in this session because we want to figure out how species are assembled into communities, in the hopes that if we can understand and explain these processes, then we can perhaps gain a better appreciation for the natural world and also predict what will happen when things change. And one of the common ways we've gone about this at the community level is to look at trait space and patterns in trait space to draw inferences of the dominant assembly processes such as environmental filtering or competition by limiting similarity. But there's a slight problem with this because theory also suggests that if species are competing along competitive hierarchies, they may produce patterns which are similar to that of environmental filtering, clustering patterns. But a lot of this work has been done in plant communities, and so the goal of this research is to explore the degree to which competition by limiting similarity on one hand, and competition or competitive exclusion by competitive hierarchies, the degree to which they explain community structure of non-plant organisms in nature, so aside from experiments. And it focuses on ants because, competition is often invoked as a strong driver of ant community assembly, and I love ants, so we focus on the very important fire ants, which are exotic to many parts of the world, especially Hong Kong, where the study was based. And the data was collected by myself in 2018, where I basically sampled plots in this landscape invaded by the fire ants. So I sampled plots with and without the fire ants and sampled all the ant communities of those plots. And the first thing we did was a preliminary analysis to generate a pairwise co-occurrence network for every species with every other species across that landscape to see patterns of co-occurrence between pairs of species in that landscape. And that showed us that the fire ants had the most and the strongest negative co-occurrences with all other species in this landscape. So much so that of the 28 non-fire ant species, if we compare every species co-occurrence against the fire ants, we find that about 2/3 of those species have negative co-occurrences with the fire ants. So this early pattern suggested to us that perhaps looking at resident species versus the fire ants could provide for a cool test of hypotheses on competitive exclusion, since these patterns of negative co-occurrences are often traditionally interpreted as patterns of competitive exclusion, although there are some problems there. And furthermore, in this relatively homogeneous landscape, where it's an open grassland, it's not much of forest, perhaps some of that community structure would more likely be driven by competition versus something like environmental filtering, since there's less environmental variation. And so we wanted to test the degree to which these two mechanisms of competitive exclusion accounted for the patterns of co-occurrences between resident species and the fire ants across this landscape. And we did this by looking at the trait relationships predicted by those two mechanisms. So basically, I won't go into much detail, but we collected lots of trait data, measured it ourselves, on many individuals for each species. And we tested the 3 hypotheses relating to those two competitive mechanisms. So I'll just request that you don't let the bird out of the cage for the rest of the slides. So the first hypothesis is the trait-similarity hypothesis, relating back to limiting similarity, the idea that species which are dissimilar can co-occur. And we basically calculated this metric of absolute dissimilarity for each trait between each species and the fire ant. It is a non-directional measure of dissimilarity, suggesting that there are no better or worse values. And the prediction for this hypothesis was that species which were sufficiently dissimilar from the fire ants could potentially co-occur with the fire ants in the same plots. So that would be species 1 in this case, represented by a gray non-negative co-occurrence pattern with fire ants. Whereas species with more overlap with the fire ants in trait space would experience perhaps more competitive exclusion because they use the similar niches or resources. And the second hypothesis was the trait hierarchy hypothesis. So this is the one where we assume that species' trait values actually represent their positions along a hierarchy of competition, where some values are better than others. And we calculated the hierarchical difference, which is basically the mean trait value of the fire ants subtracted from the mean trait value of every other species, which gives us a positive or negative value, which gives us a directional measure of trait difference. The hypothesis being that species which were further away from the fire ants along that axis of competitive abilities, such as species 1 in this case, would experience more negative co-occurrence with the fire ants. And things which were more close to the fire ants or more equivalent to the fire ants into their trait values would more likely co-occur in the same plots. So this gives us an opposite expectation from that of the limiting similarity hypothesis. And finally, we tested a third hypothesis that the two things interacted to determine co-occurrence patterns. So that is to say that species which were not dissimilar enough, species which overlapped greatly with fire ants, fell into the same competitive hierarchies. And in those competitive hierarchies, the hierarchical differences then kicked in to affect co-occurrence patterns. Whereas species like species 1 in this case would have sufficient dissimilarities from the fire ants such that the hierarchical differences in their competitive abilities did not affect co-occurrence outcomes. And so we had these three hypotheses. We had 28 pairs of species, each resident species with the fire ants, and we had 7 traits. We measured these 2 metrics for each of those pairs and each of those traits. Then we used multiple linear regression for each trait with multiple species, multiple pairs, basically testing which metric representing the different hypotheses best accounted for the patterns of co-occurrences between resident ant species and the fire ants across the landscape. And we found that for this trait, relative pronotum width, I can talk more about its potential functionality and ecological significance after the presentation. But for this trait, this model captured a decent amount of the variation in co-occurrence outcomes between resident species and the fire ants. And it can be represented in this plot here, where basically on the x-axis, we have that absolute measure of dissimilarity with no direction, representing limiting similarity. And on the y-axis, we have the competitive hierarchical difference, suggesting some trait values are better than others. And we found that there was an interaction between these two things that determined the co-occurrence of a particular species and the fire ants within that area. So that is to say that species landing in that area, if their co-occurrence was negative, signaled by a red color, that would be because of the specific relationship between their absolute dissimilarities and hierarchical differences between their traits and fire ants traits. And we further found how the interaction worked by some calculations that only in some regions of absolute dissimilarities did we see those hierarchical differences kicking in to affect co-occurrence. And these were the left and the extreme right regions. I'll now go into further detail. Oh, but first, we thought it was really cool because this model surprisingly captured a variety of assembly mechanisms. So if we look carefully, it tells us that depending on which species you are and your particular trait relationship with the fire ants in terms of absolute dissimilarities and competitive hierarchies, a different assembly process would account for whether you were found in the site with the fire ant. So I'll now go into detail into the different regions of that plot. So the first group of species were those which had low absolute dissimilarities from the fire ants, species which were similar in traits to the fire ants in trait space. And we found that for these species, the hierarchical differences in trait values actually kicked in to affect co-occurrence outcomes in a directional way. So this is consistent with the idea that similar species fall into the competitive hierarchies and compete more intensely, and that is when you have these predictable directional differences in trait values determining who can co-occur with who. And so that's the first part of that plot. And then we found another group of species with sufficient dissimilarities from the fire ants. So this is a region where co-occurrence outcomes between a species and the fire ants across the landscape was not affected by their hierarchical difference, not affected by those values on the y-axis, but only by absolute dissimilarities, suggesting that these species perhaps were sufficiently dissimilar from the fire ants to overcome any potential differences in competitive hierarchies. So it's sort of reflective of that idea of stabilizing niche differences, overcoming fitness differences. And finally, we found a bonus section, a little sliver of the plot, where these species are extremely dissimilar from the fire ants, where they are the amount of trait space they share with fire ants is almost zero. And for this region, hierarchical differences did affect co-occurrence. And the way we think this is working is because these are potentially species which are already so dissimilar from the fire ants that those trait values perhaps code for a selection for different resources. And any further departure from those trait values in a directional way in that hierarchy would further strengthen further reduce the likelihood of co-occurrence because they might be selecting for different plots altogether. So we were really excited to find this model which captured all these nuances of assembly depending on which species you were and your trait relationships with that invader. A different assembly process could potentially explain whether you were found in the same plot with the invader or not. But of course, we're not trying to say that one trait explains all of the structure. Clearly it does not. There are still things we need to consider, such as niche differentiation across multi-dimensional trait space. But at this stage, we think it's really interesting and worth discussing because it at least provides some evidence for suggesting that limiting similarity may not necessarily be the driver of competitive exclusion in every case. We need to consider how trait values of animals, and not just plants, might reflect directional competitive hierarchies. So in conclusion, traits are indeed useful for explaining and investigating community assembly, but trait-based assembly is not that straightforward. And if we oversimplify, and if we just look at community-wide patterns in trait space without looking at pairs or finer scales, and if we just look at patterns such as clustering or over-dispersion to infer dominant assembly processes, we might risk drawing the false inferences. And this is because species differences influence assembly processes in varying ways, depending on which species you are and the particular trait relationships in terms of absolute dissimilarities and competitive differences between you and the other species. That can change the way in which you're found in the same community, the assembly process which accounts for your co-occurrence. And so I guess what I want to think about more from this work is how can we better capture these nuances of assembly processes in trait relationships between pairs as well as multi-dimensional trait space. Thank you.
Have got any questions from the audience? No? This one, everyone tired? Just go home. I have a question. Community ecology is not my specialism, but just looking at your study species, is there any way you need to control for the differences between casts?
Yes, so one thing which I did, which is not often done in trait-based research, when I plotted those interest-specific trait probability density functions, they were based on values which included both, for polymorphic species, which included both workers, minors, and majors, so the small ants and the large ants, for species which have large and small workers. So to try to represent their sort of functional space better than just a species mean. And I think this is something we can move towards by including more of this natural variation at the individual or interest-specific level into our sort of models of functional space and trait space.
No, still nobody thinks of a question? Okay, excellent. I get to go again.
Thank you.
Oh no, I have another question. Sorry.
Sure.
Who helps you collect the data? Actually collects the species and the...
It was all me.
All right, so
Yeah.
I didn't know whether you had any kind of training or if there's any distinction between any kind of species misidentification?
So I am pretty confident with my species identification. I've worked on ant taxonomy before working on ecology, described a few species. So, and that's where I think morphological measurements really come into play. So that has given me a better appreciation for how these differences in morphology, whether they're functional or not, we're not so sure, but at least they help us to differentiate properties of species. And how that can play a role in perhaps assembly or interactions is something which I'm interested in at this point.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.